All right, today we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, certainly one of the most important events of the 20th century, and has a great impact on the outcome of, or the conduct and the outcome of World War I. Our objectives in this section: we'll explain the causes of the March Revolution. We'll look at the goals of Vladimir Lenin and his group, the Bolsheviks, in the Second Revolution, the November Revolution. We'll outline how the communists defeated their opponents in Russia's civil war after both of those revolutions. And then we'll look at how Lenin develops his communist state, both politically, economically, and what their long-term goals and aspirations are. Our focus question: how did two revolutions and a civil war bring about communist control of Russia? Well, during the war, as we've talked about, the Russian situation was pretty dire. Increasingly, they had problems at home economically, starving people, didn't have the infrastructure and the industrial capacity to really support their war effort. Initially, the goals of the revolution were to end the war and solve the problems at home, and those problems which had first come to light or earlier come to light in a revolution in 1905, but had really not been addressed by the Tsar. The March Revolution is known most importantly for overthrowing the monarchy, the Tsar, in Russia. The November Revolution brings an end to a provisional government and puts in place Vladimir Lenin, and then ultimately his successor Stalin, and creates the communist Russia that we know going forward through World War II and the Cold War. As we mentioned, there had been a revolution in 1905, which left the Tsar in place with some promises to address the situation. And unfortunately for the Russian people, after that 1905 revolution, Tsar Nicholas did not address Russia's problems. The Duma, or the legislature, which had been established after the revolution, really had no impact. The rulers lived in a very luxurious, high lifestyle, while the people were starving and lived in poverty. Corruption was rampant throughout the Tsarist regime. And again, the Duma, the legislature that was established after the 1905 revolution, really didn't have much impact. It was much more for show, I think, than anything else. You might compare that to the impact, early on at least, of the Estates Generale in France. While initially World War I inspired nationalistic feelings in Russia and certainly major support for the war, conducting the war was very difficult for Russia. Russia didn't have, or wasn't as industrialized as Germany, France, and England were. So they didn't have the capacity to produce enough military supplies, military weaponry, and the like to support the war effort. They had plenty of people, plenty of bodies, plenty of military, but not the resources to get them battle ready. The infrastructure in Russia was less sophisticated than it was elsewhere in Europe. Transportation systems, railroads couldn't deliver the resources back and forth from the front lines back to Moscow and other parts of the country. As we mentioned before, many of the soldiers that were sent to the front had no guns, had no ammunition. Very difficult to fight this increasingly modern war without the weapons that modern war required. And as a result, millions of soldiers died. By 1915, or in 1915 alone, Russia had more than 2 million casualties. As a result, not surprisingly, people lost confidence in the Russian government. The Tsar, in a patriotic gesture, went to the front personally and took over leadership of the military. Unfortunately, his decision didn't help very much, and he proved to be as ineffective a military leader as his other generals had been, all things considered. Meanwhile, back home, he left his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, in charge. And this wasn't exactly a great decision either. Increasingly, the Tsarina was under the influence of what they called a mad monk, Rasputin, the holy man, who the Tsarina believed had miraculous powers. And increasingly she took his advice and really wasn't able to have much of an impact on the food situation and other shortages back home. From the perspective of the population, this just further eroded the confidence, any confidence, that the public had in the government at the time. In March 1917, workers in St. Petersburg marched in protest, mostly women, shouting "bread, bread," because they were starving. Now the Tsar ordered his military to fire into the crowd. The military refused to do so. They basically mutinied against their leadership. So clearly the government here was losing control. With disaster from Russian troops on the battlefield, protests at home, economic situations at home, and other political unrest, Nicholas, at the advice of his military leaders and political advisors, decided that the best solution was to abdicate or step aside. The Duma, the legislature in Russia, again, didn't have much power, but it set up a temporary government and began the process of writing a constitution to establish a republic in Russia. Meanwhile, revolutionaries who didn't necessarily want a republic had other ideas for what type of government and solution would be the answer to their problems. It's worth noting here, as we just finished talking about the March Revolution and the two revolutions that happened in Russia, we're referring to them as the March and November revolutions. You might see them mentioned as the February and October revolutions because at this time, until 1918, the Russians were on a bit of a different calendar that was a few days off, 13 days or so off from the calendar used in the rest of Europe. So depending on the perspective and who is telling the story, it's either the March or February Revolution and the November or October Revolution. Now these revolutionary groups that we're talking about that were pushing for more radical reforms, radical government in Russia, were two distinct groups. The first group, the Mensheviks, they favored a more gradual process of reform. They wanted higher wages for workers, increased voting in the population, and sort of a social safety net, welfare programs. The Bolsheviks basically wanted what they wanted yesterday, a much more radical, drastic, immediate change. They favored a total revolution. They don't want to have the Tsar around. They want to institute their policies right away. Here you see a picture of the Mensheviks, and then the leaders of the Bolsheviks, some of whom we've seen before, and we certainly will see more of going forward. The leader of the Bolsheviks was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a follower of Karl Marx, who we talked about in previous sections, believes in the workers uniting and overthrowing the capitalist system, overthrowing the elites, taking over the means of production. He talked about having unity among workers and farmers, so the proletariat coming together. And perhaps most importantly, he promised the Russian people peace, basically to get out of World War I, food, and also land. And it's worth noting here, there's some good information in the book about the background of Lenin, but early in the war, Lenin was basically in exile, wasn't even present in Russia, but the Germans, thinking that Lenin might be able to stir things up and make it more difficult for its enemy Russia to fight, actually facilitated Lenin returning to Russia and made it such that he does get into Russia, and certainly he does stir things up quite a bit. So think about the Russian role in bringing Lenin back, and the German role in bringing Lenin back, and the German role in stirring up what becomes the Russian Revolution. In the Second Revolution, November of 1917, The transitional government wasn't moving fast enough, wasn't doing exactly what the Bolsheviks wanted. Lenin's followers seized power. They renamed themselves the Communists and put their ideas into place very quickly. So some radical changes immediately from Lenin and the Bolsheviks, or communists. Puts an end to private ownership of land and redistributes that land to the peasants. So he fulfilled that promise, giving the peasants something that they'd been asking for. Gives control of factories and mines to the workers, so the proletariat, sort of rising up. Most importantly here, he withdrew Russia from World War I. He makes his own separate peace with the Germans. So as we mentioned, Lenin pursues a separate peace with Germany while the war is still going on. So he's going to have a singular peace agreement with the Germans, and it's pretty costly for the Russians. As you can see on the map here, first of all, in 1918, the treaty is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And Russia agrees to pull out of World War I, and they also agree to give up a significant part of Russian territory. So in the north, you'll see in the blue part what they give up, what later becomes the Baltic states, and you'll see Austria gets on the bottom a lot of those gains down toward the Black Sea. Just to fast forward a bit, you can see a lot of this land that was given up by Russia is later redesignated and redistributed in the 1919 treaty that ends World War I and basically divides the land of the Central Powers, creating new borders and new states. So after Lenin pulls Russia out of the war, we have a pretty brutal civil war between the communists, which are now, for purposes of this civil war, known as the Reds, and their opponents, the Whites. Another of the communist leaders, the Red leaders, was Trotsky. He created a Red Army using former officers in the Tsarist military, led by commissars. This army was pretty well trained, pretty well led, and they were in a good position logistically in the center of Russia to fight against the Whites. Now the Whites were basically made up of other Tsarist imperial officers, but also the Mensheviks, other Democrats, and eventually even the Allies contributed in some ways to the White effort, hoping that the Whites would be able to defeat the Reds and that it would not end up being a communist-dominated government. But in the end, the Allied presence to help the Whites didn't help the Whites very much. They were ultimately unsuccessful. The Reds were able to appeal to Russian nationalism with an effort to drive out the foreigners. And if you think about the long-term implication of this, the Russians, the communists, were able to use this foreign effort from the Allies to lead what becomes a long-term distrust of the West. We'll see that play out through World War II with Stalin, but certainly during the Cold War as well. In 1918, during the time of the Civil War, the Tsar, the Tsarina, and their family were shot and killed. The communists didn't want to have any vestige left of the monarchy, and by 1920 the Red Army wins the Civil War and takes control of the entirety of Russia. Now, it's important to mention that although Lenin was a follower of Karl Marx, he recognized that the demographics in Russia didn't exactly fit the ideal or idealistic model that Karl Marx proposed. He knew that there wasn't a large urban proletariat in Russia. Remember, they weren't nearly as industrialized as other parts of the world were. So what Lenin was looking for was a very elite group to lead a revolution and basically have a dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's what he sets up as he begins to pull together his control of the country. Now, in the early years of the revolution, as we state here, Lenin's policy was basically war communism, where the government or these elites in the Communist Party take over the banks, the mines, and the railroads, so basically the means of production. Ultimately, this is not successful at all. The economy is on the verge of collapse, and many of the people are suffering under these policies. So he changes course. He establishes something called the New Economic Policy, which is something of a compromise between pure communism and capitalism. And this allows the economy to recover. So let's look a little bit more detailed the differences between war communism and the New Economic Policy. So first, not a lot of difference in who controls the means of production. The state is going to control the banks, the mines, and the factories, and the railroads, and large industries in both of these scenarios. Differences come under war communism. So the first plan, in that small businesses were forced to give up any profits that they made to the state. The compromise with capitalism was in allowing those small businesses, if they make a profit, to keep that for themselves, not having to turn that wealth, that income, over to the state. In war communism, the initial plan, farmers were forced to give their crops to feed the army or the poor, but again, this would have been controlled by the state. The compromise, which allows the economy to recover a bit, is any surplus that farmers have beyond what they give to the state, they're allowed to keep for themselves, and they're able to sell that for a profit. So once the Bolsheviks, the communists, gain control, you can see how they expand that area of control. So first of all, you can see the extent with the purple line of the Russian Empire at the beginning of World War I, when they first entered the war. You can see with the tan areas of the map, those areas that in 1919 were controlled by the Bolsheviks, within just a couple-year period, March 1921, you can see the red line where they've greatly extended the area which they control. In a continuing effort to control and gain power in his empire, in 1922, Lenin establishes Russian lands, consolidates them into what's called the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they adopt a new constitution. Okay, under this constitution, we have an elected legislature, citizens that have the right to vote, and also, at least on paper, workers given control of the means of production. Now, this looks very democratic. It looks, at least in terms of the right to vote, and very communistic in terms of giving control of the means of production to the workers, but don't be fooled. This isn't anything much more than a paper tiger. Again, recognizing that Russia is very different in its population, its demographics, than what Karl Marx ideally envisioned, Lenin's version creates a system where the elites, or the party, are the leaders of the government, and not necessarily the people. So even though he's establishing on paper that the people are in charge and in control of the means of production, and that the people are electing a legislature, it ultimately is the party that is in control. If you remember back early in this course when we talked about Ivan the Terrible and the use of his Opernitchki, his secret police, well, the secret police again have a role in this version of Russian rule and Russian government. The Cheka basically instill fear in the population, where people are reporting on their neighbors. If anyone is suspected of being against the party, against the government, they could be arrested, and there were a series of prison camps established all across the great expanse of Russia, from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific. Vladimir Lenin dies in 1924, and upon his death there is a struggle for power between Trotsky and Joseph Stalin for who's going to be the leader. Joseph Stalin ultimately is successful, becomes the leader, and he is even more ruthless in his leadership and his consolidation of power than any of those that came before him. We'll talk more about Stalin before World War II, but certainly as we move into World War II, and we'll see what an absolute dictator and ruthless authoritarian he ultimately is. Okay, our terms in this: proletariat, the working class, that should be familiar. Soviet is a council of workers and soldiers, and these were implemented throughout the country. The Cheka, the secret police, so the opernitchki of more modern times. A commissar, a party official who's assigned to the army to teach not necessarily the methods of war or the methods of the military, but to ensure that those in the military are consistent with and espousing the beliefs of the party and the loyalty to the party. So the commissar is going to be your political leader within the military, making sure that everyone stays in line. And that's the end.